While coming home from work to what I thought was my birthday celebration, I instead got a notification from my living room security camera. It wasn't an intruder, but rather my mother on the couch, talking to my 8-year-old daughter. In the courtroom, I will say he touched me here. My daughter was pointing to her private parts, while my mother gave her a thumbs up and candy. I nearly crashed into the oncoming truck, watching my daughter giggle about how she was going to destroy my life in 3 weeks' time. The surprise stuffed unicorn I'd gotten her mocked me from the back seat. The tea time photos of Gracie my mother had sent me earlier now felt tainted, but rather than reacting in anger like younger me would have, I chose to keep my cool. I placed a recording device inside the stuffed unicorn, and only then headed home. "Hi, Daddy!" Gracie called out when I came in, sprinting at me with the same sweet expression that had just been practicing my downfall. "Hey, darling," I replied, offering her the unicorn. "Princess Sparkles has a new companion for you." My mother flashed that motherly smile I'd trusted for 40 years. "You spoil her." "How was the office?" "Nothing special." I pressed a kiss to Gracie's head, my insides twisting. Over the next 2.5 weeks, I delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. I acted like I knew nothing, when in reality I placed cameras in Gracie's playhouse, her music box, even within the old iPad she played with. Every device was legally obtained and placed. My attorney would later call it brilliant. Wednesday, my mother struck again. She brought Gracie Disneyland pamphlets. The holiday Gracie's dreamed of going on, but I'd never been able to afford. "If you say the right things in court, I will take you here," she murmured to Gracie, who was truly unaware of the consequences. On Friday, they rehearsed Gracie's statement again. "Don't forget, sweetie, crying matters. The judge has to believe you're frightened of Daddy." On Sunday, she gifted Gracie a new Barbie dream house. "This is for being so brave about our secret." Every evening, I'd download the recordings to 4 different drives in my office vault. Then I'd kiss Gracie goodnight, bringing her bedtime treats before telling her I love her. I couldn't blame her. She had Down syndrome and was manipulated. She couldn't grasp the severity of the situation. When small kids behave badly, you point the finger at the grown-ups around them. The hearing came 3 weeks later. The courtroom was full. Michelle, my ex-wife, was seated with her attorney, appearing assured. She'd been demanding sole custody with monitored visits exclusively. My brothers were sitting behind my mother. "Your Honor," Michelle's attorney declared, "we'd like to summon Gracie Jones to testify." My 8-year-old daughter entered holding her stuffed unicorn. She wouldn't look at me. The court officer assisted her onto the witness chair, lowering the microphone to her level. "Gracie, darling," Michelle's attorney began, "I know this is hard, but can you tell the judge what you told your mommy and grandma?" Gracie's small voice trembled. "Daddy. Daddy touches me in wrong spots." The gallery gasped. Michelle wiped her tears. My mother leaned over to grip Michelle's hand supportively. "Where does he touch you?" Gracie indicated her private regions. "Here. He tells me it's our special secret." I sensed my attorney's grip on my shoulder, holding me down. My brothers were looking at me in disbelief. "How long has this happened, Gracie?" "So long. He said if I spoke up, he would hurt Mommy." Michelle erupted into theatrical weeping. The social workers were rapidly writing notes. The judge's expression had hardened completely. "Gracie, last question," the attorney pressed on. "Do you feel safe with your father?" Gracie began sobbing, rehearsed tears. "No, I'm scared of him. I want to stay with Mommy and Grandma always. No additional questions." The judge addressed my attorney. "Does the defense intend to cross-examine?" "Your Honor," my attorney stood up. "Before continuing, we must present new evidence that will completely reframe this testimony." "This is a stalling strategy," Michelle's attorney objected. "Your Honor, I possess 18 days of video documentation that this child was coached to lie about her father." The judge's brow lifted. "That's an extreme allegation, counselor. The unicorn she's carrying has a recording device the father lawfully installed. It has documented Gracie's grandmother training her on this precise testimony for 3 weeks. My mother's complexion drained. Michelle's assured demeanor faltered. "I'll examine this privately," the judge stated. 5 minutes passed before he returned, his expression furious. "The evidence is permissible in court." My ex-wife's lawyer tried to object but was overridden. My attorney linked his computer to the courtroom monitor, and the initial video began rolling. My mother's voice loud and clear. "Now, Gracie, remember what we practiced. When the judge asks, you tell him Daddy touched you there." Gracie's response, "But he never did, Grandma." "That doesn't matter." The entire courtroom held their breath. The following video was more damaging. "Gracie, cry when you speak. Real tears. Remember your puppy that died." "Grandma, I don't want Daddy in jail. He won't be in jail. He just won't see you for a little bit of time. Then you get to go on that Disneyland holiday." "Stop the video!" Michelle yelled, jumping up. "This is manipulation." The judge faced Gracie, his tone kind but serious. "Gracie, is what you shared with us today accurate?" Gracie's fingers twisted around the unicorn's purple mane while she stared down at the witness stand's wooden surface. Her face scrunched up the way it did when she couldn't understand her homework. She looked back up at the judge and her voice came out, so quiet I could barely hear it from where I sat. Grandma said I should say those things. The whole courtroom went dead silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The judge leaned forward just a little bit, keeping his voice soft. What things did Grandma tell you to say? My mother shot up from her seat so fast her purse fell to the floor. Don't listen to her, she's confused. The bailiff was already moving toward her before she finished yelling. The judge's gavel came down hard 3 times. Order! Sit down immediately or you'll be removed from my courtroom. Michelle had gone white as a sheet next to her attorney. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed the edge of the table. My mother dropped back into her seat, but her face was red with rage. The judge turned back to Gracie, his voice gentle again. Gracie, this is very important. Do you know the difference between telling the truth and telling a pretend story? Gracie nodded, her chin wobbling, like when I play princess and pretend my room is a castle. The judge smiled a tiny bit. Exactly like that. Now, when you told us earlier about your daddy touching you, was that truth or was that a pretend story Grandma asked you to tell? Gracie started crying for real this time, not the fake tears from before. It was pretend. Daddy never did those bad things. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. But Grandma said if I told the pretend story we could go to Disneyland. My attorney's hand squeezed my shoulder so hard it hurt. I couldn't stop the tears running down my face. The judge's expression went from gentle to furious in about 2 seconds. He stood up and his voice boomed across the courtroom. We're taking an immediate recess. Bailiff Ms. Jones and Ms. Michelle Jones are to remain in this courtroom. Do not let them leave. He pointed at my attorney and me. You two stay available. I need to review all this evidence again in my chambers. Then he looked at the social worker in the front row. Please take Gracie to conference room B and stay with her. The social worker came up and helped Gracie down from the witness stand. Gracie still clutched her unicorn as she walked past our table. She looked at me with those big confused eyes and I wanted to grab her and run out of there. The judge swept out through his door and slammed it behind him. The bailiff positioned himself between my mother and the exit. Michelle's attorney was whispering urgently in her ear, but she wasn't responding. She just stared at the table like she was in shock. My mother tried to stand up again, but the bailiff took a step toward her. Ma'am, the judge said to remain seated. She dropped back down and glared at me with pure hatred. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. I paced in the hallway while my attorney made phone calls. My brothers sat on a bench looking lost. One kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe what just happened. Finally, the clerk called us back in. The judge's face was darker than I'd ever seen anyone look. He didn't sit down. I've reviewed 18 days of recordings. What I've witnessed is the systematic manipulation of a disabled child to commit perjury. He turned to my mother and Michelle. This is one of the most disgusting things I've seen in 30 years on the bench. Michelle started sobbing. My mother tried to speak, but the judge cut her off. I'm not finished. Effective immediately, I'm granting emergency temporary custody to the father. Ms. Michelle Jones and the grandmother are prohibited from any contact with the child pending a full hearing in 2 weeks. Michelle's attorney jumped up. Your Honor, my client is the child's mother. The judge's voice got even louder. Your client conspired to falsely accuse a man of child abuse. She's lucky I'm not having her arrested right now. He banged his gavel. Court is adjourned. Bailiff, escort these women from the building. We walked out into the bright afternoon sun, and Michelle lost it completely. You've destroyed everything. You've taken my baby. She lunged at me, but her attorney grabbed her arm. My mother just stood there staring at me with eyes that could have burned holes through steel. You're dead to me, she said quietly. One of my brothers came up beside me. I'm going with you. This is insane. The other brother stayed with our mother, not even looking at me. We drove home in silence except for Gracie asking questions from the back seat. Why was Mommy crying? Why can't I see Grandma? Did I do something bad? I kept telling her she did the right thing, that telling the truth is always good. That evening, I set up her room exactly how she liked it with all her stuffed animals in the right spots. She kept asking when she could see Grandma and if Grandma was mad at her. I sat on her bed and tried to explain that sometimes adults make mistakes and Grandma needed time to think about her choices. She fell asleep clutching the unicorn that saved us, having no idea what it had done. The next morning, my phone rang at 7. My attorney's voice was serious. The DA's office wants all the recordings. They're considering criminal charges for conspiracy and child endangerment. He paused. Also, Michelle's attorney already called. They want to negotiate custody arrangements. This is just starting. I told him I'd bring the drives to his office. Then HR called. We need you to come in for a meeting about the situation. Michelle has been calling here making accusations. My boss got on the line. Look, I believe you, but we need documentation of everything. Take the day off and get your affairs in order. I spent the morning with Gracie, making her favorite pancakes and watching cartoons. She seemed okay, but kept asking when things would be normal again. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. Pietro Silva from CPS stood there with a clipboard and a serious expression. "Mr. Jones, I'm here for the home assessment." He walked through every room, checking cabinets, the fridge, looking for safety hazards. He interviewed Gracie in her room while I waited in the kitchen. Then he interviewed me, asking about routines, discipline, medical care. After an hour, he nodded. "Everything looks appropriate, but there will be ongoing monitoring. This is standard in these cases." He left me with a stack of paperwork and a schedule for follow-up visits. 3 days later, a serious-looking man named Lucas Salas showed up at my door with court papers, saying he'd been appointed as Gracie's guardian ad litem. He spent 2 hours sitting on our living room floor playing with Gracie's dolls and blocks, while asking her gentle questions about her favorite foods and what makes her happy. She warmed up to him pretty quick and started showing him all her drawings from the school. He told me his wife Flavia would be doing the psychological evaluation next week and that they'd both be making recommendations to the court about what's best for Gracie. That same afternoon, my brother called and said our mother had been trying to reach me through him, claiming she was only trying to help Michelle get fairness in the custody battle. I recorded the whole phone call on my laptop and immediately sent the audio file to my attorney since the judge had ordered no contact between us. My attorney emailed back within an hour, saying this violation of the no contact order would become evidence in our case. The next morning, I woke up to my phone blowing up with messages from friends and coworkers asking if I'd seen what Michelle posted on Facebook. She'd written this long post about how I was keeping her from her daughter and manipulating the court system against her. People I hadn't talked to in years were suddenly taking sides and sending me nasty messages, calling me an abuser, and saying I should be ashamed of myself. My attorney told me to stay completely silent online and not respond to anyone no matter how badly I wanted to defend myself. 4 days later, we had to go to the Neutral Visitation Center, where Michelle would have her first supervised visit with Gracie. Chiara Gutierrez met us in the lobby and explained all the rules to Michelle, who showed up carrying 3 huge shopping bags full of expensive toys. Chiara immediately stopped her and said gifts had to be approved ahead of time, and Michelle could only bring 1 small item per visit. Michelle's face turned red, but she picked out a stuffed bear and left the other bags in her car. Gracie kept asking me why Mommy couldn't just come home with us and why we had to meet in this strange building with cameras everywhere. I told her it was just for a little while until the grown-ups figured some things out. The visit lasted an hour, and I had to wait in a separate room watching through a window while Michelle played with Gracie under Chiara's supervision. 2 days after that, Flavia Salas came to our house for the first evaluation session with Gracie. She brought a whole bag of toys and art supplies and set everything up on the kitchen table. They spent an hour drawing pictures and playing with clay, while Flavia asked questions about how Gracie was feeling. After Gracie went to play in her room, Flavia told me she was seeing clear signs of confusion and stress, but absolutely no evidence of any abuse. She said the coaching from my mother had left some psychological impacts that would need to be addressed in therapy. The following Monday morning, HR called me into a meeting and told me they were putting me on paid administrative leave while they investigated Michelle's complaints to the company. My boss pulled me aside afterward and said he believed me, but the company had to follow protocol when accusations like this were made. I spent the rest of the day at home with my laptop and calculator, adding up all the legal bills that were piling up and figuring out how long my savings would last if this dragged on for months. Michelle's second supervised visit came a week later and went completely off the rails. I was watching through the window when I saw her lean close to Gracie and whisper something that made Gracie burst into tears. Chiara immediately stood up and moved between them, writing something on her clipboard. She ended the visit right there, only 20 minutes in, and Michelle stormed out of the building screaming that she was going to sue everyone involved. Gracie was so upset that Chiara had to sit with her for another half hour just to calm her down before I could take her home. 3 days after that disaster, my attorney called to tell me my mother had hired her own lawyer and filed a petition for grandparent rights. He said given all the evidence we had of her coaching Gracie to lie, the petition would probably fail, but it meant more court dates and more legal fees we'd have to pay. The fight was getting bigger and more expensive every week. Around this same time, Gracie started having terrible nightmares almost every night and wetting the bed again even though she'd been potty trained for years. Flavia said these regression behaviors were really common after trauma and recommended we start seeing a specialist twice a week. During one of the therapy sessions, Gracie drew a picture of our family with everyone separated by thick black lines and asked the therapist why everyone was so mad at each other all the time. The therapist gave me some strategies for answering these hard questions without making things worse for Gracie. Finally, 2 weeks into this whole mess, I got a call from the DA's office saying they wanted to interview me about possibly pressing criminal charges against my mother and Michelle for conspiracy and child endangerment. The prosecutor said they had a really strong case based on all the recordings, but wanted to see how the family court case played out first. She explained that if they filed criminal charges, it would make any chance of normal co-parenting with Michelle basically impossible, so I needed to think carefully about what I wanted to do. The second week of supervised visits arrived faster than I expected, and I was watching through the one-way glass when Michelle walked into the visitation room, looking different somehow. Gracie ran to her with her usual excitement, but Michelle just grabbed her and started crying hard, not the fake tears from court, but real ugly sobbing that made Kiara stand up from her chair. Michelle kept saying she was sorry over and over while holding Gracie, who looked confused and started crying too, because kids do that when adults cry around them. Kiara had to step in and physically separate them, writing notes on her clipboard while redirecting Michelle to focus on playing with the blocks Gracie had been building. Michelle tried to pull herself together but kept breaking down every few minutes, and finally Kiara called the session early after only 30 minutes. I watched Michelle leave the building with her shoulders shaking, and for the first time since this whole mess started, she looked broken instead of angry. 2 days later, I was giving Gracie lunch when the doorbell rang, and Pietro Silva was standing there with his clipboard saying he needed to do a home check. No warning, no phone call, just him at my door at 1 in the afternoon on a Thursday. He walked through every room checking the locks on the medicine cabinet, looking in the fridge to see if we had food, checking Gracie's room to make sure she had clean clothes and a safe bed. Gracie followed him around, showing him her drawings and her stuffed animals, while he took pictures and made notes. After 45 minutes, he sat down at my kitchen table and told me straight up that he'd seen way worse situations than ours, and that Gracie was clearly safe and well cared for in my home. He said his report would reflect that, and the judge would definitely take it seriously since he'd been doing this job for 15 years. My brother called me that same evening, and his voice was tight when he told me our mother had been calling all our aunts and uncles and cousins, telling them I was dangerous and abusive. She'd been saying the recordings were fake, and that I'd manipulated everything to steal Gracie away from her and Michelle. Half our relatives had already blocked me on social media, and the other half were sending me nasty messages about how I was tearing the family apart. My brother said he'd tried to tell them the truth, but nobody wanted to hear it because our mother had gotten to them first with her version. The family reunion we'd been planning for summer was canceled, and my favorite aunt, who'd basically helped raise me, wouldn't even return my calls anymore. 3 days after that, Lucas Salas showed up to observe Michelle's next supervised visit, and I could see him through the glass taking notes about every interaction. Michelle was more composed this time, but Gracie kept looking between her and the door, like she didn't know what was expected of her. When Michelle asked her about school, Gracie started talking fast about her teacher and her friends, but then stopped mid-sentence and asked if she was supposed to be telling Mommy these things. Michelle's face crumpled, but she held it together while Luca wrote something down. At the end of the visit, Gracie hugged Michelle, but it was stiff and awkward, not like the natural hugs they used to share before all this started. Luca talked to me afterward and said Gracie was showing clear signs of divided loyalty and fear of disappointing either parent, which was common in these situations, but still concerning. He recommended switching to therapeutic visits where a counselor would be present to help them work through the emotional stuff while rebuilding their relationship. The deposition happened the following Monday in my attorney's office, and I sat behind the one-way mirror watching Michelle answer questions under oath. Her lawyer kept trying to object, but my attorney pushed through and finally asked her directly if the abuse allegations were her idea. Michelle sat there for a long minute before admitting that my mother had suggested it when she was panicking about losing custody. She said she was desperate and scared, and my mother had convinced her it was the only way to keep Gracie safe from me, even though she knew I'd never hurt our daughter. Her own attorney looked ready to strangle her as she kept talking, explaining how my mother had coached her on what to say and how to act in court. By the time she finished, she was crying again and saying she just wanted what was best for Gracie, but everything had gotten so out of control. Tuesday morning, the school called because Gracie had told her teacher during sharing time that she had 2 homes now, but couldn't see Grandma anymore, and the teacher was concerned. They needed updated custody paperwork for their files and wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss what support services Gracie might need during this transition. The principal also mentioned that Gracie had been having trouble focusing in class and had started chewing on her sleeves again, which she hadn't done since kindergarten. I spent 2 hours at the school filling out forms and talking to the counselor about strategies to help Gracie cope with all the changes. Flavia's preliminary report arrived by email that Thursday, and I read it 3 times to make sure I understood everything. She wrote that Gracie had clearly been coached to lie, but showed absolutely no signs of actual abuse, physical or emotional, from me. She noted that Gracie was a happy, well-adjusted child when discussing her time with me, but showed anxiety and confusion when talking about the court situation and her grandmother. The report recommended continued therapy for Gracie and a gradual return to normal parenting time with both parents, though she specifically noted that the grandmother posed a risk to Gracie's emotional well-being and should have no contact. My attorney called it a slam dunk, but warned me Michelle's lawyer wasn't done fighting. Sure enough, 2 days later, my attorney called to say Michelle's lawyer had filed a motion claiming the recordings were illegally obtained and should be thrown out as evidence. The judge scheduled a hearing for the following week, which meant more time off work that I couldn't really afford, and another $5,000 in legal fees that would drain the last of my savings. My attorney said he was confident we'd win since the recordings were made in my own home with devices I legally owned, But he also reminded me that nothing was guaranteed in family court, and judges could be unpredictable. During Gracie's therapy session that week, she spent the whole time drawing instead of talking, and when the therapist asked to see what she'd made, it was a picture of our family with everyone separated by thick black lines. She'd drawn me in one corner, Michelle in another, Grandma way off to the side, and herself in the middle with lines going to everyone but all of them black and heavy. The therapist explained that Gracie was trying to process the fragmentation of her family, but the dark lines showed how troubled she was by everyone being separated. We agreed to increase her sessions to 3 times a week, even though my insurance would only cover one, and I'd have to pay out of pocket for the other 2. The deposition for my mother was scheduled for Friday, and my attorney said I could watch from another room if I wanted. She showed up with her lawyer looking older than I'd ever seen her, like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. When my attorney started asking questions, her lawyer immediately advised her not to answer, and she took the Fifth Amendment on every single question about coaching Gracie, about the recordings, about her involvement in the allegations, everything. She just sat there repeating that she was asserting her Fifth Amendment rights while staring straight ahead. My attorney told me afterward that taking the Fifth in a civil case like this was really damaging for her grandparent rights petition because the judge could draw negative inferences from her refusal to answer. He said she'd basically killed any chance of getting visitation rights for at least a year, maybe longer. The motion hearing happened the next week, and I sat there watching Michelle's lawyer argue that the recordings violated privacy laws since Gracie didn't know she was recorded. My attorney stood up and explained that I had every legal right to place recording devices in my own home and on items I purchased, especially when my child was potentially being harmed. The judge took 10 minutes to review the law before ruling that the recordings were legally obtained and would remain as evidence. Michelle's lawyer immediately filed an appeal notice right there in the courtroom, which meant this whole mess could drag on for months more while they fought it in higher courts. That night, after I tucked Gracie into bed, she looked up at me with those big eyes and asked if she made everyone fight by telling on Grandma. My heart broke into a million pieces as I sat on her bed and told her that none of this was her fault, that grown-ups sometimes make bad choices and she was very brave for telling the truth. She nodded, but I could see she didn't really understand why everyone was so mad at each other. The next morning I called her therapist, who gave me some strategies for handling these conversations, like keeping explanations simple and age-appropriate while reassuring her that she's safe and loved. Pietro Silva's report arrived at my lawyer's office 3 days later, and I read through all 20 pages while sitting in the waiting room. He recommended that primary custody should remain with me based on the evidence of manipulation and the stable home environment I provided. He supported supervised therapeutic visitation with Michelle, noting that she seemed to genuinely care for Gracie, but needed professional oversight to rebuild trust. The part about my mother was harsh but fair, stating that she posed a clear risk to Gracie's emotional well-being and should have no contact until further evaluation. My attorney called it a victory, but reminded me it was incomplete since the judge would still have final say, and Michelle's appeal could change things. 2 months into this nightmare, I was looking at my bank statements and realizing my savings were almost gone between legal fees and taking unpaid leave from work. I started calculating what I could sell and thought about my car, but then remembered I needed it for all of Gracie's therapy appointments and supervised visits. My brother, who had supported me from the beginning, noticed I was struggling and showed up at my door with a check, saying it was a loan, but we both knew I might never be able to pay it back. Taking that money created another layer of complicated feelings between us, but I had no choice if I wanted to keep fighting for Gracie. Michelle's next supervised visit happened at the Neutral Center with Kiara watching every interaction. I waited in the lobby reading old magazines while they played in the observation room. Kiara came out afterward and told me it went really well, that Michelle followed all the rules and just focused on playing dolls and coloring with Gracie instead of trying to discuss the case or manipulate her. She noted in her report that their interaction showed improvement and genuine affection without any concerning behaviors. Maybe there was actually hope for some kind of normal co-parenting relationship once all the legal stuff settled. The DA's office called my attorney the following week to say they'd decided to file misdemeanor charges against my mother for conspiracy to commit custodial interference. 2 officers went to her house that afternoon and arrested her, though she was released on bail within hours. My other brother, who had stayed quiet through everything, finally called me that night screaming about how I'd destroyed our family and gotten our mother arrested like a common criminal. I tried to explain about the recordings and what she'd done to Gracie, but he hung up on me, and we haven't spoken since. Gracie's therapy sessions were showing real progress according to her therapist, with fewer nightmares and less anxiety about the supervised visits. She was sleeping through the night more often and didn't cry when it was time to see Michelle at the center. But she still asked me almost every week when things would be normal again, when she could see Grandma, when Mommy could come to our house instead of that weird building with all the toys. I never had an answer that wouldn't break her heart, so I just kept saying soon, even though I had no idea if that was true. The full custody hearing finally arrived 4 months after that first emergency hearing. The courtroom was packed with lawyers, social workers, and family members, though the crowd looked different this time. My mother sat alone in the back row because even Michelle had moved away from her after learning about the criminal charges. The judge spent the first hour reviewing months of reports, recordings, and testimony from all the professionals involved. He had Pietro's recommendation, Chiara's visitation reports, Flavia's psychological evaluation, and stacks of other documents. Luca took the stand first and testified in detail about Gracie's needs and his observations over the past months. He said Gracie needed stability above all else and recommended I maintain primary physical custody based on the evidence and his interactions with our family. He supported graduated unsupervised visits with Michelle if she completed parenting classes and continued to show good judgment during supervised visits. When asked about my mother, he was direct in saying she should have no contact with Gracie for at least a year, and only then with therapeutic supervision. Michelle's attorney tried to poke holes in his testimony, but Luca had done his homework and answered every question with specific examples and professional certainty. Then Michelle took the stand, and I watched her hands shake as she was sworn in. She looked different from that confident woman at the first hearing, smaller somehow and tired. She admitted she'd made terrible choices out of fear and anger after our divorce, that she'd let my mother convince her the allegations were the only way to get custody. She said she wanted what was best for Gracie and would do whatever the court required to be part of her daughter's life. My mother's attorney stood up next and started talking about how she was just trying to help her granddaughter based on concerns Michelle had shared about my parenting. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and said the evidence clearly showed manipulation of a disabled child who couldn't understand what she was asked to do. He denied her grandparent rights petition right there and said he'd seen enough. The judge then laid out his ruling, and I felt my whole body relax for the first time in months. He gave me primary physical custody, with Michelle getting supervised visits at first, then therapeutic visits with a counselor present, then eventually unsupervised day visits if everything went well. My mother was banned from any contact with Gracie for at least 1 year, and only then with therapeutic supervision if she completed required programs. Michelle just nodded and accepted it without arguing, which surprised me after everything. The bailiff handed me the custody order, and I walked out of that courtroom holding Gracie's hand while she clutched her unicorn. That night was the first time in months that Gracie slept through without any nightmares or crying. She seemed lighter somehow, like she knew the scary court stuff was mostly done, even though she didn't really understand what had happened. The next morning, we celebrated with ice cream for breakfast, which made her giggle and ask if we could do it every day now. Over the next few weeks, Michelle started her required parenting classes and began therapeutic visits with Gracie at the center. The counselor was there for every visit, helping them work through everything slowly. At first, Gracie was confused about why Mommy could only see her in that special room, but the counselor explained it in ways she could understand. Michelle followed all the rules and focused on just playing with Gracie instead of trying to talk about what happened. After about 6 weeks, I noticed Gracie started smiling during the visits again, instead of looking worried the whole time. The counselor said they were making good progress rebuilding trust, and Michelle was doing everything right. 3 months after the hearing, Michelle got approved for her first unsupervised Saturday visit. I dropped Gracie off at her apartment that morning and spent the whole day nervous about how it would go. When I picked her up that evening, Gracie was happy and chatty about the park and the painting they did together. It was the most normal thing I'd heard from her in half a year, and I almost cried with relief in the car. Around that same time, my employer finally cleared me to come back to work after their investigation found no merit to any of Michelle's accusations. Walking back into the office was weird, and my colleagues were awkward at first, not knowing what to say. But after a few days, the routine of work helped everything feel less raw, and I was grateful to have something normal in my life again. My mother ended up taking a plea deal for reduced charges and got probation plus 200 hours of community service. Her attorney sent me a letter she wrote taking some responsibility, but also blaming me for destroying the family and turning everyone against her. I read it once, then threw it away without responding because there was nothing left to say. Gracie's therapy sessions dropped from 3 times a week to just once as she got more stable. The therapist showed me her drawings, and they showed our family getting closer together, though Grandma was completely absent from all the pictures now. She said Gracie was processing everything really well for her age and condition, which made me feel like maybe we'd get through this okay. Michelle and I started co-parenting counseling to figure out how to communicate better about Gracie without all our old problems getting in the way. The first few sessions were tense, with both of us having to bite our tongues a lot, but the counselor kept us focused on Gracie's needs. We worked out schedules and protocols for pickups and drop-offs and how to handle school events and medical appointments. It wasn't easy, but it was productive, and we both stuck with it because we knew Gracie needed us to make it work. 6 months after that terrible day in court, Michelle had regular weekend visits, and we were managing school events together without any drama. We'd sit in different sections at her school play, but we both cheered for her and took turns taking pictures. Other parents probably thought we were just another divorced couple managing shared custody and had no idea about everything we'd been through. Gracie seemed genuinely happy with how things were working and would talk about what she did at Mommy's house and what we were doing at Daddy's house like it was all normal. The new normal was actually working better than I ever thought it would after everything that happened. My brother, who'd stuck by me, showed up the next weekend with a moving truck and helped us pack everything into boxes for the smaller place across town. The rent was half what I'd been paying and would help me catch up on the legal bills that kept coming every month. Gracie didn't understand why we had to leave her big room, but got excited when I let her pick the wall color for her new one. My other brother sent a text while we were loading boxes saying maybe we could talk at Christmas, but he needed time to process everything. The apartment was cramped and the neighbors were loud, but it had a little park nearby where Gracie could play. She asked about Grandma while we were unpacking her toys, and I told her Grandma needed time to think about what she'd done. She just nodded and went back to arranging her stuffed animals on the new bed. Michelle called a few weeks later to say she'd gotten a job at a clinic with better hours that would let her be more flexible with pickups and drop-offs. She actually thanked me for keeping things stable for Gracie while everything was falling apart around us. We weren't friends and probably never would be, but we were figuring out how to be parents together. The 1-year anniversary of that terrible court day came and went without my mother trying to petition for any kind of contact. My brother told me she'd moved to Arizona to live with her sister and was working at a garden center there. Part of me was relieved she was gone, but another part felt empty, knowing she'd chosen to disappear rather than try to make things right. Gracie's therapist said she was ready to graduate from regular sessions after 18 months of hard work. Her teacher reported she was doing great in the school and had caught up to where she should be developmentally. We kept the therapist's number in case we needed it, but Gracie was moving forward. Michelle and I both went to Gracie's spring play where she played a flower in the garden scene. We sat in different rows, but both stood up clapping when she remembered all her lines. The other parents probably just saw two divorced people being civil for their kid. Nobody knew about the recordings or the accusations or how close I'd come to losing everything. I finally made the last payment to my attorney after working overtime for months and getting help from my brother. The whole mess had cost me almost $30,000 in 18 months of financial stress. Gracie never knew I'd been eating rice and beans for dinner while she got her favorite foods. Michelle asked if we could meet at a coffee shop without Gracie to discuss something important. She wanted to try week-on, week-off custody now that Gracie was older and doing better. I was nervous about giving up time with Gracie, but called Luca to get his opinion. He said if both parents were stable and committed, it could be good for Gracie to have equal time. We agreed to try it for 3 months and see how it went. Gracie was so excited when we told her she'd get a whole week at each house. She started planning what toys to keep at each place. 2 years after that day in court, Gracie mentioned at breakfast that she'd had a nice dream about Grandma. She wasn't sad or upset, just sharing like she would about any dream. I told her that was nice and asked if she wanted to help me make pancakes. She moved on immediately to talking about her friend's birthday party that weekend. The new custody schedule actually worked better than either Michelle or I expected. Michelle had really changed and was taking responsibility for her choices and putting Gracie first. We managed parent-teacher conferences without any tension and even coordinated on Christmas presents so we didn't duplicate. The social worker closed our case after 2 years, saying we were one of the success stories. Gracie was thriving, and both parents were cooperating. Nobody would have believed where we'd started from. My brother called me out of nowhere 6 months later, asking if he could come to Gracie's birthday party. I told him yes, and hung up before either of us could make it weird. The party was at a bowling alley with Gracie's friends from her special needs class. My brother showed up with a wrapped present and helped set up the lanes without mentioning our mother once. The other brother sent a gift card with a short note saying happy birthday. Gracie was too busy knocking down pins with the bumpers up to notice the family tension had shifted. Michelle arrived with the cake and we worked together getting candles lit while my brother took pictures. Nobody watching would have known we'd been in court fighting over custody just months before. Spring came, and Gracie saw a flyer at the school for a sleepaway camp designed for kids with special needs. She brought it home in her backpack and asked if she could go for 2 weeks in summer. Michelle and I scheduled a tour together the following Saturday. The camp director showed us the cabins with extra supervision and the medical station with trained nurses. We walked through the activities area where kids were doing adapted swimming and horseback riding. Michelle asked about emergency protocols while I checked the counselor ratios. Gracie ran ahead, pointing at the arts and crafts building where they were making friendship bracelets. We filled out the application together in the main office, splitting the deposit down the middle. The director said Gracie would do great based on what she saw during our visit. 3 weeks before camp, I ran into my mother's old friend at the grocery store. She was buying tomatoes when she saw me and froze for a second before walking over. She told me my mother was doing okay in Arizona and working at her sister's garden center. I said I hoped she was well and moved my cart toward the checkout. She called after me that my mother missed everyone, but understood why things were how they were. I kept walking and loaded my groceries without looking back. Michelle called me 2 days later saying she had something to tell me in person. We met at the coffee shop near Gracie's school while she was in class. She showed me an engagement ring and said his name was Kevin, and he was good with kids. I asked how long they'd been together, and she said 8 months. She wanted to make sure I was comfortable with him being around Gracie before they moved forward. I told her I wanted to meet him first, but appreciated her asking. We set up a dinner at a family restaurant where Kevin turned out to be a middle school teacher who understood special needs kids. He didn't try too hard and let Gracie warm up to him at her own pace. After dinner, Michelle and I talked in the parking lot about boundaries and expectations. Kevin would never try to replace me, and any discipline would come from Michelle. I told her I was happy she found someone stable who could be good for Gracie. 3 years had passed since that day in the courtroom when everything exploded. Gracie was in 5th grade now with a group of friends who came over for playdates. She was reading at grade level, and her teacher said she was one of the class helpers. The IEP meetings were routine now, with Michelle and me both advocating for the same goals. Her confidence had grown so much that she performed in the school talent show doing a dance routine. The other kids cheered when she took her bow, and she beamed the whole way home. That October was the district's Special Needs Advocacy Fair, where families could learn about resources. Michelle signed up to run the summer programs booth, while I volunteered at the legal resources table. We worked our separate stations all morning, helping other parents navigate the system. A mother with a newly diagnosed child asked how we managed co-parenting so well. Michelle and I caught each other's eyes across the gym and shared a quick smile. If she only knew the lawyers and recordings and accusations it took to get here. The afternoon brought the awards ceremony for the peer mentorship program. Gracie had been helping younger kids in the special needs pre-K class during her lunch period. The principal called her name for the kindness award, and she walked up to the stage in her favorite purple dress. She took the certificate and waved at both Michelle and me in the audience. Her speech therapist had helped her practice saying thank you into the microphone. Watching her stand there so confident made everything we'd protected her from worth it. She was going to be okay despite all the adult failures that tried to break her world apart. That night after I tucked her in, she sat up and told me something. I like having 2 houses because I get double everything good. She counted on her fingers, listing 2 bedrooms and 2 sets of toys and 2 birthday celebrations. The simple joy in how she saw our situation hit me hard. Kids really are stronger than we give them credit for when adults finally stop making things worse. All right, friends, that's a wrap for this story. I hope it left you smiling as much as it did me. Stick around. I've always got more heartwarming moments to share. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.